really appreciate all of you across the big state of Texas coming together for us to talk about pathways again. Since we weren't able to come together in April, it's nice for us to revisit where we had been. And so we have a couple of guest speakers with us today, but before we jump in, I wanted to share a little bit about the Pathways work and how it has changed through the pandemic, even from the Success Center, and what we're planning on offering to you all in the coming months and then leading up to our next institute. But before we do that, I just want to let you know that we have the Q&A box. At any point you want to ask a question, since you don't have audio, please feel free to type in the chat box and we'll monitor that. And I want you to know that everything's being recorded, so it will become available to you as soon as this is over. We will then move both the recording of this webinar and the slide decks into the events page on the Texas Success Center website. So with that, I open our model. We open each institute with looking again at our model, and so I just reground us that even as we've moved from phase 1 to phase 2 in this good work, that we continue to be accessing it through our model. It remains the same as it has from the beginning, that we, as we always say, we begin with 8th graders making their selection of their endorsements and help give a clear path all the way through the community college to further education and careers. And so we remain with that same message and that same sort of dedication to social and economic mobility, which is even more important these days than it ever has been, and taking our systemic view of how we're going to help students get there. So we remain the same message as we move both from phase 1 to phase 2 and moving through our postponed April event into our November event. So a little bit of logistics about how we are thinking about still supporting you through your pathways, implementation, and scaling. We have Pathways Institute number 2, which was the one that was supposed to happen in April. And its topic was and continues to be mapping pathways to students' end goals. And we're going to really focus in on careers, which is so timely. So we're going to continue that topic for the event, which is now moved to November. You see the dates there. We already have the hotel secured, so fingers crossed we'll be able to do that. The asterisk is because if we aren't able to get back together by that time, things are still a little unknown. And so if we don't have the opportunity to be together in November, then you'll get more information from us about how we would like to transition the content of this and the support of this Institute on Careers to an online format. We know that it's timely and that we want to continue with our institutes and continue to support you in scaling that. And so look for information from us. But for right now, go ahead and mark your calendars. We are going to plan on being together November 18th through the 20th. So the advanced work had already come out to you all for the April event. It continues to be the same or very similar. So you'll get some information in early June. So look for an email from Dr. Christy Short updating you on that advanced work. Some of you eager beavers had already completed your advanced work for the April event, so kudos to you. That work can remain exactly the same, but for those of you who had not finished it, then more information will come out about how you might use even more current data. But either way is just fine, and you can find all of that advanced work at our website on the events page. A couple other things that we're doing to try to continue to support you even though we can't see your smiling faces, a couple of webinars. So we've been doing a webinar series also led by Dr. Short, which have really been more about COVID-related response efforts. And now we're transitioning our webinar series as well over to supporting your pathways work. And so the first one will be May 28th at noon for an hour, where we're going to have an expert from California come and talk about the California model of multiple measures. And so again, very timely. I see the CAOs emailing each other about that and supporting each other, how we're going to even take more advantage of this moment to use multiple measures. Also coming out very soon from the Success Center, our research associate, Christina Flores, has put together a really great piece on multiple measures where she's done an extensive lit review on multiple measures and also gives examples of multiple states and how they're using their opportunity to use multiple measures to place students. So look for both of those things to be coming soon, and be sure to register for that when that information is out to you. And then another webinar that we're going to do, this is basically repurposing a pre-institute session that we had planned with our good friends from the Community College Research Center, Dr. Hannah Lahr and Davis Jenkins, who had planned on being with us in April and doing a workshop with you. And that workshop was going to be on accelerating your pathways reforms by analyzing your students' entry into programs of study data. And so they have graciously agreed to turn that pre-institute session into a webinar. And so that's going to be held on June 25th at 10 a.m. So that's a 2-hour workshop webinar. And much like the pre-institute, this webinar will also be kind of a first come, first serve, and it was going to be open to about a dozen or more teams so that the workshop can be effective. And so the first set of colleges who can sign up with teams will be a part of that workshop. So we will start with the teams who had already signed up with the pre-institute and let you have first dibs on the slots. And then we'll open it up to the rest of the state, whoever can pull teams together for that workshop. So we'll be going over the data that you're turning in for your advanced work, as well as some workshop data requests that will be sent to you as you register for that event. So looking forward to that as well. So as we transition then to our speakers, I wanted to share a little bit of information about some data that we've been pulling in preparation for our next institute, and even about the new world order that we're living in now. First of all, I want you to know that we've been doing some analysis about the work, your pathways work that you were doing prior to this, and we're really anxious to show you some new data at our next institute about the relationships that we're finding between your scores on your scale of adoption assessment and the essential practices. So I'll give you an example. We found that those colleges who are the most advanced in scaling, particularly the essential practices of Pillar 2, which is helping students get on, to choose and to get on a path, we're finding a relationship between the colleges who are scaling those practices and the early momentum measures. For example, the one that measures students who have completed 6 or more credit hours in their first term. And so it's exciting to start showing some of the impact of the great work that you're doing. So more to come on that front. But now, as we transition to today, Pathways Through the Pandemic, we have 2 really great friends of Texas. I know that many of you know both Alison and Rob. They have been a part of this good work in Texas from the beginning. They've been good friends to the center. They've been good friends to your colleges. I know they have been presenters at our institutes, and many of you have had them come out and give presentations and work with your colleges. And so they're no strangers to you and to this good work. But by way of introduction, I will tell you that Dr. Alison Kadlec is the founding partner of Sova and specializes in building cultures and climates for innovation in higher education and workforce development. With a core commitment to advancing genuine socioeconomic mobility for more Americans, Sova pursues its mission through distinctive approaches to coalition building, strategic planning, and change management. And Alison has done a great job helping us infuse those kinds of concepts into our institute. So I thank you, Alison, for being with us today to talk some more about dealing with the pandemic. And then following Alison will be Dr. Rob Johnstone, and no stranger to Texas, but I will tell you that he is also a founder. He's the founder and president of the National Center for Inquiry and Improvement, NCII, and he works to help 2- and 4-year colleges create structures and improvements and processes that increase student completion, learning, and labor market outcomes. So I look forward to hearing from Rob and what you have to share, because you've both been working with so many colleges across the country. So by way of context, I want to share just a couple of data points about what Texas looks like right now. So we're dealing with a pandemic and we're pressing through, but the numbers are pretty startling. So across Texas, I was looking at the Texas Tribune and showing the unemployment rates, and there are nearly 2 million, if you can believe it, 2 million Texans who filed for unemployment in the last 3 weeks. It's just completely wildly unprecedented. And the conversations around Texas say that we anticipate that those numbers are even going to continue to increase in the coming days. And what this means, though, is that there's been significant shifts in businesses. There's been a lot of jobs that have been eliminated, but this report showed that also at the same time, 500,000 new jobs have been created. So there is even more than ever, there's a serious mismatch between the workforce needs and those that are unemployed and underemployed even before this pandemic started. One last data point is around a survey that we did at TAC after the pandemic broke out. We did a survey of community college students across Texas. And we found out a lot of things, and I'll share this one with you, that when we asked them about their job loss and whether they have lost hours or if they have, if their income had decreased, over half of the community college students said that they had. And what's even more startling is that when we disaggregated that, we found that Black students and Hispanic students were more significantly hit by this pandemic than any other student population. And so that's kind of the backdrop of what I know you all have been dealing with moving courses online and all the other myriad ways that you've been reacting to the pandemic. And so with that, we just thought the timing was perfect to ask Alison and Rob to come and talk to us about what we should be thinking about as we're pressing through. So with that, I'm going to turn my screen over to Alison and ask her to begin.
All right, thank you so much. Hopefully you can see my screen now. Let me know if you cannot. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for the introduction. It's really an honor to be here with you all today. And I'm going to dive in and pave the way for Rob's presentation here. I'm really excited to also be here with you, Rob, and to listen to what you're learning from your great work around the country. What I'm going to focus on here is what we are learning over the last couple of months. Time is so strange now, isn't it? So we are a couple of months into this. And here are the things that I want to focus on today. So diving in to help teams think about what it means to protect, advance, and/or reset your guided pathways priorities amid the unknowns of the ongoing crisis, and provide some concrete tips and tactics to strengthen and galvanize your leadership teams across silos under the current conditions. These are unprecedentedly challenging times, and want to begin with a recognition that, really the human brain isn't particularly equipped for what we're going through right now as a country and as communities and as individuals. And so modeling something that I want to suggest that we all do in practice, I want to pause here and just ask you to check in with yourself. You can pop something into the chat, or you can just reflect for yourself. How are you feeling today, right? One of the things that we know from our work around the country, and also just our team, as we navigate the support that we're trying to provide to institutions and systems around the country, is that, how one is feeling in the midst of a pandemic changes day to day. And how you feel day to day impacts your ability to do your work, your sort of reservoir of hope and resilience and optimism. And so being aware of where you are in, day to day, and being aware of where your colleagues are and taking time to check in both with yourself and colleagues, we think is a great place to start when you are thinking about your work and what it means to protect and reset your work under current conditions. So I want to share with you a couple of ways to think about student success work in a time of crisis. The Sova team has some crisis management folks on our team, and we've been talking about what it means to apply some of the lessons from disaster relief and crisis management to change management and change leadership work and higher ed reform. And, this is sort of the standard typical way of looking at the phases of emergency management, right? You have your initial response, sort of the search and rescue. You've got a recovery period and a mitigation period and a preparedness period. But what we're facing, as you all know, is a kind of crisis that we have never seen before in this country. And so unknowns about the length and severity of the pandemic really shape this, this sort of lens and this frame of student success work in a time of crisis. We still, when we think about, at least for us, the folks on our team who have backgrounds in emergency management and disaster relief, they work on things like hurricane recovery or terrorist situations. So these are the events that come and go, pretty quickly, and the aftermath is clear when that period begins and when the crisis ends. And we do not have that same knowledge in this crisis, right? So the unknowns about the length and severity of the pandemic, we know that until there's a vaccine, that this is going to continue to smolder and probably erupt in various ways, the pandemic impacting communities and individuals. And so we still also, Cynthia shared some of the latest statistics about the stark ways in which communities and individuals and families are being impacted, but we still don't know the full extent of the impact on communities and the economy. And this is going to unfold over time. And then you add to this the unfortunate reality of toxic politics in this country, and you have a very different kind of crisis from others that we have dealt with. And so when we think about the fact that most institutions, by virtue of your accreditation, are required to have contingency plans for your operations under conditions of, for example, an active shooter or a hurricane, there are not really contingency planning, there's not really effective contingency planning in place for this sort of thing because we have not been through this sort of thing before. And no institutions, as far as we know, have contingency planning for student success work in a time of crisis. And so this is one frame for thinking about student success work in a time of crisis and the phases of recovery. But what we're finding, and generally our orientation to work and to adaptive change leadership, is that there's another frame that is maybe more helpful for thinking about student success work in a time of crisis. And it's this one. So this is adapted from the Institute for Collective Trauma and Growth. And this is the human experience of crisis. This is the human experience of, and the stages that human beings go through as they experience a crisis and the aftermath. So again, we don't really know, where folks are. We know that in recent weeks, as we've been, as a growing number of institutions have said, all right, we, from the immediate sort of search and rescue phase of getting everything online, protecting the immediate needs of our students, we are rallying, right? But this is a protracted period of crisis in which institutions are needing to adjust. And so this kind of framework for thinking about the human experience of crisis is one that is worth interrogating and considering, right? So many of the folks that we're working with around the country are describing incredible pride in their institutions, the things that their faculty and staff and cabinets and leaders and others at every level of the institution have done to rally to support and protect students during this time. And so we're hearing lots and lots of stories of the amazing work that people are doing. But we also know that this is the period that is coming for many folks. And this is where we slide from a sense of kind of excitement and pride in what institutions and colleagues are able to accomplish during a crisis into a period of disillusionment and exhaustion. And it has to be said that even in, so we're a couple of months in now to this, it is exhausting to be in a constant state of crisis, right? And so as people are exhausted, there's the strong possibility, this feeling of disillusionment or this feeling of burnout, we get here faster, right? And so what does it mean to try to sort of know where you are and see what is likely coming down the line? So for us, we want to focus here. This is here and everything between here and the danger zone. This is a period or a part of the human experience where there are really easy to miss, hard to seize opportunities for culture building, for attending to strengthening your teams in the midst of ongoing crisis. And it's extremely easy to miss and hard to seize because people are so pressed, because you are working so hard just to keep things up and running and moving under these new conditions to help your people, your faculty and staff adapt to our temporary new normal, not knowing what the real new normals are ahead, right? So when we think about change leadership work or adaptive leadership skills right now and what it means to reset and protect your student success work, we're really interested in helping institutions seize this particular moment, right? So what does it mean to attend a culture building during this moment? So the rest of the stuff here that I'm going to share with you sort of flows from this idea that here's where we want to kind of flatten that disillusionment dive. We want to acknowledge that this is a much longer process than any that we have seen before as a country when it comes to crisis, and to equip you, help you think about the strategies, tools, and tactics to protect and advance your student success work. Because as Cynthia said at the outset, your work has never been more important. It has never been more vital. All right, so here are a few tips. I'm going to walk through these and then I'm going to dig in a little bit on them. So practicing self-awareness and meeting people where they are, why that's so important right now, what it means to orient to purpose and listen to those closest to students to really understand what's happening and how to meet the needs of your faculty, staff, and students. Collectively considering this never waste a crisis adage, we're hearing this more and more, but what does it mean to do that in a very mindful way and not at the expense of those who are already beleaguered and quite tired? What does it mean to calibrate to collaboration and embrace the muscle building that entails, right? This is extremely hard work under normal circumstances to engage in cross-silo collaboration. It's absolutely essential for guided pathways work, for comprehensive dev ed reform, for transfer work, but it's extremely difficult to do, and it's never been more important. What does it mean to prioritize supporting leadership in the middle? We talk about this a lot, and I know that many of you think about this continuously. What does it mean to actually support those who are in those critical sort of mid-level positions across your institution, and what are the right dots that need connecting in order to support and protect your student success work, your guided pathways work? And then what does it mean to actually revisit your student success priorities and over-communicate, particularly about your values right now? As your institutions are facing this crisis, you're not only in a position of needing to respond to your students' needs, but you're also in a position of needing to think about your student success work in the context of the responsibility to serve as engines of recovery for your communities and your region and your state. That is a lot. There's a lot on your shoulders, right? So what does it mean to anchor in your values, and what does that do for you? And then upskilling in budget conversations by practicing. I mean, there is no particular magic in strategic finance. It is extremely hard work, and there's a whole lot that is unknown about the future of budgets for institutions. But we also know that there are a lot of conversations that are happening right now, a lot of decisions that are being made right now, and a lot of communicating across priorities right now as they relate to budget conversations that are really important for protecting your work moving forward. And then finally, and this is very practical in the weeds, you know, interrogating your meetings. How are your meetings going? What does it mean to be protecting your ability to strengthen your teams in this world of social distancing? And it's not just your imagination. Zoom fatigue is a real thing, and it is exhausting. So let's dive in a little bit here. All right, so tips for restarting student success work. So we know this, you know this intuitively, but it's important to reflect on it actively and to think about what it means when you're communicating about your work. Stress negatively impacts creativity, resilience, and optimism. These are the things, these are precious resources that you're gonna need in abundance to carry on your work. And so being sort of aware of where you are. So again, going back to that, how are you feeling today, right? It's extremely important to be aware of where you are and to practice perspective taking at each step. So this idea that as you enter into conversations with your team members, as you engage in your 5th Zoom meeting of the day in order to accomplish tasks and move work ahead, really taking moments to be aware of where you are in your mind and being aware of where your colleagues are is extremely important. And we're hearing a lot of stories about what that looks like in practice and how important it is for teams. This idea of orienting to purpose. So here's we've been talking both informally and formally to faculty, staff, and administrators around the country doing large-scale, comprehensive student success type reform work like guided pathways. And we're hearing things continuously from faculty members now that are along the lines of this faculty member. Actually, this is a faculty member in Texas who said this to me. I'm more aware than I've ever been about my students as humans. We're all seeing each other in real ways, right? So people are closer to their purpose, right? Faculty to their purpose, staff, advisors, others. You know, your purpose in your work is extremely important to protect your sort of your own resilience to orient to that purpose, and to dedicate yourself to listening to the front line, to listening to those people who are closest to students and students themselves. I know a lot of you are doing amazing work in that, really taking the time to listen and to calibrate your understanding of what's going on with those who are in fact closest to students and students themselves. I know that no presentation with Rob would be complete for him without me including a John Dewey reference, and so I just want to remind us of what Dewey said about nobody knows like the person wearing it how the shoe pinches. And so this is the importance of attending to those who are right up front in this. And there's this idea of never wasting a crisis, right? It is extremely important to consider this adage and to plan around it and to be aware of the new maneuvering room that you may have, that you absolutely have available to you because of the way in which the world has been permanently changed in ways that we still don't completely understand. But it's also the case that people are increasingly tired, right? That this is a long and protracted crisis. And so the idea of never wasting a crisis can't be conflated with steamrolling everybody in order to execute your will. So that you're still going to need the energy and collective creative energy and commitment of those. And so all around you, at multiple levels of the institution. So this is a VP of Student Success at an institution in Missouri who said, you know, this crisis is exposing gaps that we've known about but haven't fixed. If we're ever given the chance, we can't go back to business as usual. And we are hearing this as well, ample stories from around the country of the incredible gaps, the equity gaps that are being exposed. And it's not just about who has access to technology and who doesn't. The extent to which this crisis is exposing the gaps that your student success work has always been designed to address and fill is, it's never been more stark. And so it's extremely important to sort of attend to that as you connect the dots between your student success work and the experience of the crisis, the ongoing experience of the crisis. And then again, this, you know, some of these things, a lot of these things are things that we preach under all circumstances before COVID that are even more important now. And this is one of them, getting clear about and communicating early about important decisions as they're made. So erring on the side of transparency to build confidence. We know that where there's ambiguity, that is always filled with a threat narrative by human beings. And so the extent to which you can help mitigate the anxiety that people are feeling by being clear and transparent about decisions as they're made is extremely important. I think the tendency often is to withhold information until you have a really strong sense of what you're doing because you don't want to share information and then change what you're doing. You know, you want to be really clear. But the fact is that there are so many things that are unknown at this point about what the future holds, that helping people understand what decisions have in fact been made and why, and which decisions are still coming can be extraordinarily helpful for just helping to settle people in the work. So I'm not going to take time right now to dig into this, but I am going to pose this here for you, not only for you to think about yourselves as a reflection for those of you who are leading student success leadership teams from multiple levels within an institution, but also sort of, you know, you can think about this yourself, but also I suggest using this as discussion fodder for your teams and returning to these questions. These are the questions that we are returning to again and again with the institutions that we're working with. And it's really interesting how the answers to these questions are evolving as people's experience of this crisis evolves and as institutions rally to meet the needs of students. So what are you most proud of, right? And in a moment, I'm going to come back to why it's important to really not only reflect on and put words on what you're most proud of, but to document that for yourselves as you move forward. And then what are the biggest gaps, challenges, the inequities that are being exposed in this crisis that you want your institution to stay focused on, that you don't want to lose sight of, that you don't want a survivalist instinct, for example, in your institutions to pull you away from this broader, larger work that if you are successful with it, which your institutions in the country are depending on you to be successful with it, will also be the path to securing your long-term sort of health and vitality as an institution. What are those challenges, right? And then what are the things that you've already been able to accomplish or that you think you'll be able to accomplish because of your current circumstance, right? We know that there is a lot of fear and anxiety about the things that won't be possible, about what happens with budgets in the future, but what are the things that you actually have been able to accomplish or that you think you'll be able to accomplish? These are important points of reflection for you individually that can help you communicate more effectively with your team as you think about them. They're also good discussion items for folks. And again, the answers to these questions evolve as your situation evolves. So finding ways and opportunities to return to these questions can be really helpful for folks. And then what does it mean to calibrate to collaboration and prioritize supporting leadership from the middle? So psychological capital, we've got a nifty little acronym here. It makes it easy to remember. These are the things that make, this is essentially the recipe for motivation. And we know that internal motivation of a critical mass of your faculty, staff, and administrators is absolutely essential for implementation of guided pathways at scale under normal circumstances, no less so under these circumstances, right? People need to feel hope. They need to feel that they can make a difference, that they have a sense of efficacy. There has to be, and this is something I know Rob talks a lot about too, resilience, productive persistence. And there needs to be some measure of optimism, right? That we do see there's hope in things being better and hope that we can accomplish, and we see concrete paths toward that, grounds for optimism. So what are the things that we are observing with the institutions we're working with around the country that sort of contribute to this kind of psychological capital for folks? Creating space for people to actually work through this working through process that people need to go through in order to integrate the changes that are coming, to integrate the complexities of the crisis in various ways. That working through process is something that can't be circumvented. It is something that can be accelerated and it can be attended to in the course of pursuing concrete work, but it is something that can't be gotten around. We are hearing wonderful stories also from institutions everywhere about particular departments or divisions or areas within colleges and access-oriented universities where peer support, where the department or the school or the college has galvanized around a set of practices associated with helping people kind of take stock of where they are, support each other, learn together, and find better ways to support students amid the unknowns. And so I guarantee you that in your institution, and you may know what some of them are, but you may not know where they all are, there are some incredible bright spots where attending to those and understanding how the human beings in those bright spots are dealing with each other, are structuring their meetings and their conversations, can be an incredible opportunity both for lifting up the good work that is happening, but also for then extending those practices to other departments, divisions, areas of your institution. We know that it is extremely important to document the honeymoon period, even if it's just taking notes in a Google Doc that you share with your team or a legal pad next to your desk or whatever it is. Documenting the things that you are most proud of, the things that you have accomplished, that you have been proud of in your own work, in that of your colleagues, because you're going to want to return to those pride points as things get harder, as people are exhausted and needing to continue. Finding ways to step back and recharge is going to be extremely important. And those pride points, those places, those very concrete examples of, I was so impressed when you did this, or when our Center for Teaching and Learning rallied and we got iPads in the hands of so many students so quickly. I know, there are these kinds of stories that you want to be able to hold on to and return to. In the places where you have been surprised, pleasantly surprised in the very early on in this about people's responses and willingness and ability to rally for students, documenting those for yourself as well so that you can go back and remind yourself and remind your colleagues can be very helpful. And then, we know this. We know that there are some percentage, some portion of your faculty who are extremely uncomfortable with the shift underway to supporting student learning in a virtual format. We know that there are folks who are extremely uncomfortable with translating advising practices and effective advising into virtual settings. And I want to just, as a former faculty member, I want to just focus very quickly on the faculty piece here. We know that for people who are passionate about their subjects and passionate about their students, that for faculty, that sense of competence in your subject matter and that sense of connection to your students is a fundamental part of your identity. And in a situation like this, you are, faculty are sort of robbed in many ways of that sense of competence and security, and it can be extraordinarily unnerving. And for those who are least equipped to make this shift to supporting high quality virtual learning experiences for students, taking time to meet those folks where they are and give them what they need in multiple ways and multiple venues is extremely important. And also acknowledging, just sort of acknowledging from a place of empathy, how hard it is for faculty who do not feel well equipped to make this shift, and how likely it is that that discomfort is going to increasingly express itself, if you will, as anger or hostility or resentment or resistance of various kinds. And that, taking some time to understand that when you peel away some of those reactions, what you find are people who are scared of not being able to be successful, scared of not being equipped to do what's being asked of them, scared of failing their students. And so, it's important to sort of cultivate that sense of understanding and awareness along the way. And then grounding communication and engagement activities in recognition and appreciation. I mean explicit recognition and appreciation of the ways in which faculty and staff are stressed and pressed is extremely important. So as you shift your communications, your planning, your work, weaving together your crisis communications and your student success work, as many ways and places with as much specificity as you can to acknowledge, recognize, and appreciate what it is that those who are closest to students are going through is extremely important for helping to build up that reservoir of hope and efficacy and resilience and optimism on the part of the people whose energy and creative commitment is going to be most important for this work. All right, so a few last things here. So revisiting student success priorities and over-communicating about your values. I said this before, that, that's extremely important. And again, this sort of goes back to hope and efficacy and resilience and optimism, that understanding the core why of your student success priorities, anchoring those in your values, your individual values, your institutional mission, and your commitment to your students is extremely important. It's a tremendous opportunity in this crisis to reset your case making. We preach and have been preaching and will continue to preach before, during, and after COVID, that case making for something like guided pathways is not something that happens once and then you move into implementation. It's not a phase and then you move on to the doing. Case making has to evolve. It has to evolve continuously, and this is under normal circumstances, much less under circumstances of extreme uncertainty. Your case making needs to evolve with your circumstances. You need to upskill as many people and widen the terrain of people who are capable of making the case for why you're engaging in large-scale student success work, why you are protecting that work, even in a time of crisis. That case-making work has to evolve not only because your environment evolves and your circumstances evolve, but also because your work matures. You understand more. And as people understand more, they need different kinds of case making. They need different kinds of communication about the work. And so anchoring in your values and your mission is extremely important. We also know, and we know for a fact, there's some very talented comms folks within institutions across Texas who are tasked with weaving together the kind of crisis communications around COVID and the visible attention to your student success strategy. It can be extremely difficult to marshal your comms and marketing folks who are typically focused on external communications or internal communications of a particular kind, and to equip those folks to really understand the student success strategy, to understand the why of your guided pathways work, and to be able to connect the dots in communications between crisis response, the way that your institution is responding to support students and to support your communities in your region, and the specific ways that you are remaking and continuing to commit yourself to remaking your institutions in service of better and more equitable outcomes for students. And then this upskilling and budget conversations, we are definitely make the road by walking kinds of people, and think this is the case as well here. And we're having, a number of conversations with folks who have talked about, and I'm thinking now of sort of math chairs, chairs and department folks, sort of mid-level, upper mid-level leadership, sort of from chairs up to those levels right at and under the provost, who are both trying to protect their work, reset their work, and they're maybe not in the middle of those conversations, the budget conversations that folks are having. And typically, we know that one of the big challenges with this work, with guided pathways work in general, is connecting the dots between the sort of academic student affairs work on student success and the CFO and the budget folks, right? Those conversations often remain disconnected to the peril of the work and to the peril of relationships. And so using this opportunity, this necessity of this crisis to connect those dots. Conversation with a math chair in Ohio recently at an institution. Actually, it was an access-oriented four-year institution, so I'll take it out of your sector as an example. She was describing that that budget decisions had been made in which a set of positions were going to be eliminated, and that those positions on paper from the folks in the most senior leadership positions looked like the best place to cut, trim, because they didn't want to impact full-time faculty. They didn't want to impact advisors. So for those sort of removed from the nuts and bolts of the student success redesign work, they looked at these positions and said, all right, we have to cut someplace. This looks like the place. And she said, what they don't understand is if those positions are eliminated, that means that this institution is no longer doing co-requisite math. And they were on the cusp of scaling co-requisite remediation in math. And she said, I don't think that people understand the implications of that. And as she was talking it through, she said, I have to figure out a way to get into that conversation so that as decisions are made, our leadership is fully aware of the consequences, of the unintended consequences, right? So connecting the dots between budget crisis conversations and student success priorities is extremely difficult. There isn't a clear formula for doing it, but there's also no particular magic in strategic finance. So practicing the discipline of these conversations is, we think, the best shot that people have of making that particular road by walking. And then unpacking the implications of the stimulus relief for guided pathways and using this as an opportunity to build stronger working relationships between, for example, the student success leadership team and the financial aid folks, right? So there's a lot there around the stimulus relief that is fodder for improved habits of communication across student success leadership teams that you have the opportunity to connect the dots on. All right, last, and then I'm going to turn this over to Rob. This is a set of very in the weeds attention to team building kinds of ideas. Again, all of this we're updating, based on conversations and work with colleges around the country. And so, we're learning from those who are doing a particularly excellent job. We're learning from those who are struggling, and we're working shoulder to shoulder with a number of folks trying to make their work under these conditions, okay? So interrogating your meetings. So the fact is that improving meetings and the quality of meetings was a key need before COVID, right? And it's even more important, and it is more difficult now. So often when we're working with an institution, we'll ask, it's called the miracle question. If you came to work tomorrow and your institution functioned the way that you think it should for a healthy culture and climate for student-focused innovation, how would you know? What would you see that would let you know that your institution was in a better position with a stronger, healthier culture? And invariably, people say our meetings would look different. Our meetings would look different. We would have different kinds of meetings. Our meetings would take different shape, and people would behave differently in the meetings, and we would do different things in the meetings, right? So this is an incredible opportunity to interrogate meetings, and there's also a set of really, new challenges. So here's something that's not new. You need to have clear, achievable agendas for your meetings, and solid facilitation still remains absolutely essential. There is no such thing as an idea that's good enough or evidence that's strong enough to take the place of strong working relationships between human beings. And so the quality of your work will rise and fall according to the quality of your facilitation and your ability to create the right kinds of meetings for folks. And that begins with clear, achievable agendas. Always check in with people on a personal level first. I don't think that this was one of the things that, we preach how important it is to stay connected to the human beings because it's the human beings and how they feel about themselves and each other that impact what people are able to do in their work. But I realize, in this situation, in this moment with COVID, that it's absolutely essential to check in with people first on a personal level in meetings, because you have no idea what folks are going through, right? Personally, professionally, whether it's balancing homeschooling young children while working, whether it's dealing with family members who may have the virus. There are just a host of things that are impacting people's lives, and being aware of what those things are and treating each other as human beings as you get into your hard work is really important. And then practice community organizing skills. So to compensate for lack of connectors. So I've had a number of folks talk to me, people within institutions, usually cabinet level folks or VPs, sort of upper mid-level folks who say, I didn't even realize I'm the person that is always up out of my chair, walking to other people's offices, staying connected to folks, checking in on people. And I didn't realize how much that was keeping me both in the loop and how much that was helping me connect people to each other in our work. So when you don't have that in this age of social distancing and you don't have these connections, what is it that you can do to compensate? And so, for example, doing those one-on-one conversations before the group Zoom meeting, right? To see where people are, to sort as many issues as you can, to minimize the surprises that come in the group conversations can be extremely important. So that's one of the first, we call it a community organizing skill for those of us in the Sova team who have backgrounds in community organizing. It is about getting, sort of minimizing the surprises and making sure that you know as much about where the people are that are coming to the table before they get there. And then it's not your imagination. Life on video conferencing is absolutely exhausting. Even if you can see human beings in your video screen, the fact is that your brain is not equipped to make sense of that. You are deprived of a host of nonverbal cues that you have when you're in face-to-face meetings. You just don't have access to those, but your brain is still looking for them. And so that kind of prolonged split in attention can create a sense of being drained while also feeling like you're not accomplishing anything, right? And so video conferencing can be extremely, extremely exhausting. So don't assume all meetings are best on video. Early on, 1, 2, 3 weeks into this crisis, I was seeing all kinds of recommendations out in the world about everybody needs to be on video, make it the default. That is not always the best. So know which meetings are best for video, where that's necessary, and don't assume that they're all best on video. Don't assume that all meetings should be in 1-hour increments just because that's how the clock and the calendar work. You can get an awful lot done in 15 minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes if you have a specific task you're trying to accomplish. So interrogate your increments of your meetings, right? Consider your meeting size. For those of you who have had large meetings on Zoom, you know that it's hard, even if you, or any video conferencing software, even if you have breakout rooms. So consider meeting size, try to keep your meetings small, and consider recording your meetings to cascade information, right? Have a 20-minute meeting or a 30-minute meeting on a specific topic, record it and share that so that people can get information even if they can't be there. And then harvest insights from your best faculty about what it means to foster learning and collaboration in virtual formats. I had recently a great virtual happy hour with a bunch of faculty members from New York, and they were just sharing and talking about the different brain breaks they were doing. They were sharing with each other, the kinds of things that they're doing in their classes. You have incredible resources at your fingertips in your institutions. In the form of faculty who are well-versed and comfortable with virtual settings, and they can help you kind of develop the skills and the competencies to have better meetings. So way into the weeds on having better meetings, but we know that those meetings are the sort of the units in which work happens for many of you, and so the things that you can do to make them stronger, we want to help you do. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob. And I will stop sharing my screen now and mute myself, but I am also going to catch up on chats here, and we'll be happy to either answer questions at the end or answer questions afterwards via email for folks.
All right, and I'm coming up live here, Allison. So hoping that everyone can see this now. Let's give me a quick look here to friends, anyone. I will assume someone will chat me or Q&A me to stop me if they need to, but I'm going to move forward with my section of the presentation. Allison, thanks so much for setting the table there. There's so much great information in there. I'm going to actually land what I'm going to talk about in one of your areas. It was really helpful to hear you kind of think about the kind of process of getting this work done in the new world that we live in. And one thing that we've spent a lot of time in the last couple of weeks, I have a bunch of random thoughts in my head before I get going here. I love the don't always assume video is best conversation, because I think that progression of the first 3 weeks where we were all on video, and then I think I've estimated somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 to 100 Zoom video sessions since this all started, and it is absolutely more draining. I have found, by the way, that at least in my work, that when we do these Zoom video meetings, that 60 minutes for some of these town halls and these sessions that we're doing is too short, and 90 minutes is too long. We found our sweet spot to live at about 75 minutes. Which worries me, because we're now doing a presentation where I would then have 12 minutes. But I will hop into this really quickly, and if thereafter we get near the end of this, if people, I would happily come back and explore this stuff more with my friends in Texas. It's good to see so many of you online, so many names, and all the colleges that we've worked with in Texas. It's great to be here again. And what I'm going to share with you today is a couple of slides. And so what happened right after the pandemic happened is NCII, as everyone else, shifted. And I was, many of you know, I spend about 200 days a year on the road. I'm on day 68 here in Connecticut, where I've been back at home. And it's given us a lot of time to rethink, a lot of the work that we do and the necessity to be on the road, the situations that really would be ideal to be with colleges, and things we can do with alternate methods. But early on, we got asked the question, this was actually with some work we had done in Michigan, to kind of reflect on what does the pandemic mean for guided pathways in terms of, and what is the effect of the pandemic on guided pathways efforts at colleges. And NCII, Priya Chaplot, and I got asked this question around both student financial stability and guided pathways. And as is our want, we tend, when we get asked a question like this, to rely on our great set of national partners. And where Allison spent a really great time talking about the overall process of rethinking your work right now, we asked a much more specific question, which is, what is it in the guided pathways world that we might need to rethink or adjust our thinking on, at least in the short to medium term, because of the effects of the pandemic? And you can see on this slide, we went to our great group of national partners, Kay and Gretchen from ACC, our folks at CCRC. I'll have Davis and John, who you already know well, in a couple of weeks. Linda, who I see is on the call, Garcia, and Evan Wailele of CESI, which is awesome. And there's a great slide from Linda coming up here soon. Our friends at Aspen, Josh Weiner and Keith Witham, and then a couple of our kind of closely held folks like Ed Bowling, the former cadre chair for completion by design for North Carolina, and Chris Baldwin, who was at JFF when CBD started and also was involved with helping the Student Success Center. So all of this thought capital is shared among all of us, and so we thank our good friends for their efforts here. And so just first of all, what's the backdrop here? And it's actually a quote is very close to one of Alison's, that, you know, Guided Pathways has really always been about colleges making system level changes and at scale changes to our cultures and structures to fundamentally evolve and optimize the student experience so that vastly more students complete. When I think about this, some of you have heard one of my rants where I think if you really are honest, if we're honest with ourselves, and I worked for over a decade at community colleges in California, most of the structures we had historically in community colleges were designed to do one of two things. The main thing it was designed to do is keep the status quo going, which is basically to roll the existing model forward and make sure that it persevered kind of as it went on into the next year or the next decade. And we had lots of committees and structures that were designed to do that. Or we were really good at innovating for small numbers of students. And so the way I think about this is, look, if you think of the word change, you've got capital C change for really small numbers of students. That's what we did with our programs, with highly innovative programs that we had in many of our colleges. Or we had lowercase c change in like 1-point font at scale. And then we sat back and wondered why outcomes didn't change. Well, it's because we didn't actually try to change outcomes by making big changes at scale. It's, of course, harder to make big changes at scale. And I think part of our learning of the last decade of Guided Pathways work, as well as the other work Alison was talking about, transfer and DevEd math work, has been about how do we make scaled changes may require a different set of structures. That's another conversation for maybe another webinar about how to get there. But as we reflect on this Guided Pathways work with the pandemic, I mean, one of the things this California Guided Pathways leader says, this pandemic is exacerbating the existing flaws in our system for our most marginalized students, but it also forces us to try and fix them. She went further on and say, look, we had all these gaps and fissures in the system that are now chasms, and we know that if we don't do things, students are going to fall through. Those gaps and fissures before affected many students, but now the barriers are much greater. And the other administrator noted that the Guided Pathways was birthed to address the existing crisis, the equity and social justice crisis of not enough students, especially historically marginalized students, reaching their goals. And now the pandemic, a new crisis, almost forces us to finally address the existing crisis. These were, by the way, unsolicited quotes from colleges that we asked, how do you think about Guided Pathways in this new world order? And then we kind of asked these leaders, what are your thoughts and recommendations? As colleges, just a short set of recommendations. We asked for a couple from each of them. How do Guided Pathways efforts need to evolve in a COVID-19 world? And so these are summarizing their thoughts. They're not meant to be a definitive word or a playbook. They're just kind of thoughts that were shared really right after the pandemic started about what things that might need to adjust. We as a group, all those organizations you see on the slide, agree with the recommendations, but we've also noted the primary source. I should also point out that these are individuals from those organizations responding. It's not AACC making a public press release on what colleges should do. This is two people from AACC talking, same with CCRC and Aspen and CESI. So let's just kind of dive in here. We came up with 9 areas that colleges could think about and recommendations around a COVID-19 world and Guided Pathways. We're going to walk through each of these individually, but collectively, the notion of full program education plans probably takes a higher importance. Thinking about the maps that many of us have created, retargeting those to the different segments of students we're going to have in this world. The next 3 really deal with the issues of online advising and student support teams and connection and belonging. And then 2 focusing in on the classroom. What does effective teaching look like online, and how can we help people get there? Another one on integrating 21st century skills and active learning in general, but particularly in the online classrooms that so many of us are wrestling with now. And then the raising of technology-related inequities. And finally, the need to integrate student financial stability efforts into Guided Pathways. Many of you know that NCII has been kind of on the forefront of trying to marry these 2 worlds together. My colleague, Priya Chaplot, who has done some great work on the student financial stability front, also thinking about how to fuse that in with the Guided Pathways world. We actually have projects in both Michigan and California that are designed to integrate those 2 worlds right now, and that was pre-pandemic. We think this is even more important now. I would point out that during Alison's presentation, she had that section that was called Revisit Student Success Priorities and kind of over-communicate about your values. It's interesting because I think of these 9 recommendations as fitting into that Revisit Student Success Priorities. Alison was talking a lot about making the case over and over, and we couldn't agree more with that you need to continually make the case. And one of the many reasons you need to continually remake the case is you get closer and closer to affecting the entire campus with your guided pathways efforts. People who just assume this was all going to go away now need to have the case remade to them when they believe this is actually getting closer and closer to their world. Everyone's willing to change another department on campus under a guided pathways umbrella. Faculty are very willing to change student services and advising models. Student services are very willing to change the way faculty does stuff. And then the trick to all of this and the challenge is how do we do this all together, cross-functionally and collectively. But I do think these 9 recommendations fit in that kind of bullet, if you will, of revisiting your student success priorities in the short term to medium term in a COVID-19 world. Let's start with number 1, full program ed plans. And this is something that I think early on, the Guided Pathways movement talked a lot about program mapping. And this goes back to completion by design, those colleges in Texas, El Paso, South, Dallas, Alamo, Lone Star, who were with us in the early days of this journey, and Texas Completes, which came right after that. There was a huge emphasis on program mapping, which is, by the way, still incredibly important as a foundation. I think one of the things that we learned in the early years to the middle years of this now 10-year movement is that we needed to much more strongly emphasize that students at the end of the day don't need a map. They need a customized full program education plan. And our friends at AACC and CCRC, although it's also supported by everyone else, including mini CESI focus group results and student videos, talk about the importance of getting a full program ed plan. CESI's research has long been cited, long been noting that developing a full program plan has been cited by students as perhaps the most important service their college provides. And that was before the pandemic. And I would just say, as I sit back from this, one reflection would be, it is very easy in the current time to slide backwards into a course-focused world, where we tell students just take some courses, you're going to take some courses, and to kind of let the focus on a program and on the plan slide. And we think this is the reason this one's first. We think this has to be even more heightened now, that we think about what strategies do we need in this currently online only world, and perhaps for the fall for most of us, online or primarily online world. How do we help students get that customized full program ed plan? The pandemic, Alison and Christy, everyone talked, and Cynthia, the multiple disruptions and hardships are placed on students. So what I would say in the face of all that is you need to be laser focused. We talk about what's our values and our student success priorities in our own internal case. I would throw out there that you strongly need to remake the case for why students should be with you in the first place. Why are they there? What program are they in? What is this going to lead to, right? And so, because it's very easy, I used to say all the time, it's very easy for students to break up with us. I can cite a wide number of reasons that they stop coming. And we historically will say, it's the students' lives, it's not us. The students are telling us it's them, which, if you've ever dated and someone tells you that it wasn't you was the reason you broke up, you should probably know that it was. And I would argue that in this case, that a lot of that has to do with the value proposition. A lot of students don't understand the value proposition with a college. And this notion of a full program ed plan that's backward designed with a clear goal that students can buy into, man, it was critical to establish that value proposition for the student coming in. It's even more critical now. This leads us to the second, this kind of purpose and direction and a vision of the way to surmount the recession leads to the second recommendation, which is from CCRC, which is that thinking about each academic division or major or perhaps meta-major, what is a short set of recommended program maps that have now available offerings? And this could be from short workshops to full programs that include coursework that are really designed to enable students to advance to better jobs or transfer with junior standing. And I think the important part of this, you could say, hey, we did that already. I think taking a fresh look at it, some of you might have to ask the question, what can students take right now because of the inability to get face-to-face labs or face-to-face CTE programs in certain areas? But I think the second part of this might even be more important, which is that thinking about the maps for different types of students. So Texas, very strong, maybe the strongest state in the country on dual enrollment. So what does dual enrollment mean now as you move to the fall? What types of maps should we have for dual enrollment students? What about those who just left high school? I'm going to talk more about the recent high school grads in a second because they're a very unique population this time. Reverse transfer. I mean, you're going to have in theory, a larger reverse transfer population this summer and fall. And if you're not careful, that very much could either devolve or shift into random course taking for those reverse transfer students. How do we ensure that they're getting the support they need to move back forward throughout their process? And then, of course, the vast numbers of unemployed or underemployed adults and displaced workers who are seeking a career shift. And I think that using these, what I would call segments or scenarios, lenses on your programs, combined with what are the things that we think in the new world economy that's evolving, where would we point people right now? This sounds really hard, right? It sounds like, man, I don't know if we can make the decision about where to point people in the workforce right now. Just remember that if you don't take that on, you're leaving it to your students to take that on without your help. And that seems to me to be a much bigger problem than wrestling with it yourself and trying to point students in a direction that is moving toward a goal. So the notion of maps targeted to student segments from CCRC is the second recommendation. The next three are really about support. Aspen, I mean, many of you have had to do this already. This was a kind of recommendation that came out right after the pandemic started, but we need a centralized and significantly enhanced online advising or call center resource that not only kind of conducts the classic advising about information on courses and programs and continuing the study, but things like emergency aid, getting mental health services, locating community resources. This part of this really ties to the ninth suggestion about basic needs and student financial stability. And I think, note that it says call center resources here. I'm sure that if we ask the question across Texas, how many of you have been repurposing some of your folks who maybe are working from home who can't do their day job at home? We've heard some amazing stories from around the country. I see Laura Rittner on the call here, the Success Center from Ohio, where Sinclair, the numbers, I mean, I get exactly right, contacted or made 16,000 contacts with a newly set up call center with employees who couldn't do their day job while they were at home. And in that way, we're providing a support structure to those students. I think many of you in Texas are probably either doing this or exploring it. And I think one of the questions that comes up with this is what is the resource list? What are we trying to achieve with the colleges? I saw in the earlier Q&A, someone asked about how do we handle our communication stream between various actors on our campus and students. And look, this was a problem pre-pandemic, right? We had students asking questions in the face-to-face and online worlds, and our communication was very disconnected in most cases. And it can seem like the only answer to this is a technology answer, but as you saw in my brief response to that Q&A, I do think much of the answer has to do with who do you want to handle what types of questions, and what's a simple way for now to record that information that students get. Because we've known for years, Ceci and many others, Public Agenda and Sova, who've done research on students, the immense frustration they have from getting a different answer to the same question. And that really is a challenge for many of our students. And so thinking about those communication streams and getting kind of that handled with your online advising. And again, this is another time where I make my plea for that advising is not a person, it's a function. And yes, you have people that you've hired as advisors to do advising, but many other people were already advising before this and could advise, whether it was your outreach people, whether you have student success navigators, your classified staff in the front of your departments are always doing like kind of unofficial advising. Faculty in classrooms are doing advising, whether it's formal or informal. So trying to get a sense of how to keep this all together, this is a huge challenge, right? This was a challenge before the pandemic. And I do think it leads us a lot to this idea that comes in number 4 here around the student support team. Like the idea that CCRC, you see this from folks like Melinda Karp in Phase 2 advising, who used to be at CCRC, the idea that student support teams and student success teams have many different definitions. CCRC is suggesting here that for now, making sure every student gets a faculty member and an experienced student in their field of interest as resources for them in planning and navigating the college. So this is, you'll see student success teams discuss much more broadly than just a faculty and a student member. But for now, in these times, they're suggesting that students are going to need support even more than they did before. So why not use experienced students and or faculty who are willing to help in the short term? The fifth one, kind of this notion of connection and belonging. So this is one that's near and dear to the heart of the folks at CESI and AACC, also NCII and the rest of the partners, is we've talked for a long time about how do we build a sense of connection and belonging to the institution. A lot of the research that comes out of the equity space suggests this is one of the primary reasons that so many students from historically marginalized populations don't succeed in college, is they don't feel a sense of connection and belonging, or as Laura Rendon, from you folks in Texas would say, from UTSA, a sense of validation that their experiences matter and that they are worth higher education. And so I think this was something we struggled with in a face-to-face environment. How do we create that connection and belonging? I would submit to you, this is maybe one of, to me, the most important things you could focus on in the short term, especially with this group of new students who's going to come in this fall who won't get to experience your college, most likely in face-to-face ways up front. How do we build in this sense of connection and belonging so they feel valued, they feel validated, they feel supported? And you can guess, because we're Guided Pathways folks, that we think that the online, that it is possible to take online this learning community function of meta majors, that you actually have support structures in place that are customized by that initial choice a student made about whether they're more interested in business or natural sciences or the arts and humanities. How do we create a community for them within that? And that is a huge challenge, but it's something that is likely even more important now in a COVID-19 world. So this notion of a sense of connection and belonging, how do we build that online? I really think these last three kind of fit together, if you will. Now a couple on teaching and learning. Look, I mean, if you're like most colleges, certainly the ones that I work with, I would say I had about a third of the faculty at most of the colleges I work with, somewhere around a third, who taught regularly online. And if you take the other 2/3, the vast majority of whom we threw online in 2 or 3 days, realizing that, wow, we can get some amazing things done in a short period of time. We have classes that people said could never be taught online being taught online right now. One might ask the question if it's the optimal modality for some of these courses, but for now, we're teaching them online. And you guys are all finishing or just finished a semester where you adapted very quickly. And so now in the summer is really the time to think about, all right, what does effective teaching look like online? What is my institution's line in the sand about the 4 or 5 things that we hope every faculty member does online, whether they're practices or approaches? I would argue this should be faculty driven, but I do think this is an incredibly important point that Aspen's raising here. Is how do we do professional development over the summer? I had some colleges in Arizona tell me that they were going to be training close to 1,000 faculty over the summer in more effective techniques of teaching online, in anticipation of that being how this goes in the fall. How do we do student services in the classroom online, knowing still that even with the best student support structures in an online world, that it's going to be faculty interacting with students as the primary point of contact. And so that's all stuff to be figuring into the mix here. Look, I mean, if I think about this, if you had a third of your faculty before who are online, and now maybe half of the remaining 2/3 go online, see some things they can use there by either having some courses online or also maybe having features of their primarily face-to-face courses online, whether that's officially hybrid, meaning 50% or more of it is online, or just interactive tools. I think you really have the opportunity here for this to go somewhere and produce a stronger sense of pedagogy going forward. But stepping back again, I think we want faculty driving this first. But I do think there's a lot to the idea, and I've done this with a college in North Carolina, a couple colleges in Ohio, about making clear statements about what effective teaching looks like at your college. I'm not saying administrators should do that, or presidents, or you should adopt one from some national organization. But it seems to me that having a faculty group over the summer say, here's what effective teaching looks like in an online world, maybe in the face-to-face world, might be a great place to start, and then thinking about the professional development that might come around that. This is a quote Linda Garcia shared with us from CESI, so thank you for Linda, who's on this webinar. I just heard a student on a webinar panel talk about the transition to online learning. From her experience, one instructor is doing well. Another instructor, she had yet to receive any communication about the course. This was like 2 weeks after the pandemic started, so hopefully that's got communication at some point. And for another instructor, that instructor is constantly communicating as if the course is never ending throughout the day, which is making it challenging for the student. We need to think about how to help colleges better prepare and support faculty for online teaching. I will just tell you, I love the third piece of this. How many of us have, elementary school age or middle school age children right now? I have 2 high schoolers and a 5th grader. The high schoolers have largely adapted to their situation. They're kind of self-reliant and kind of moving things forward. But if you have elementary or middle school teachers, you know that our K-12 teachers who aren't used to teaching online are also struggling with this. And I very much am sympathetic to the student about the third instructor, because I feel sometimes as if my my stepson's K-12 fifth grade teachers are assuming that we are doing nothing else around the day than being teachers, when in fact, there's two parents trying to work and they're navigating the various world. And look, so many of our students already dealt with these multiple modalities, and Alison talked earlier, and so did Cynthia, about like the challenges that our students are facing, and maybe this will help us have a little bit more empathy for the challenges our students face on a day-to-day basis as they try to juggle all these responsibilities when we're forced to. Even in positions of privilege, forced to juggle these. We have a lot of students without the social capital and the resources to navigate the things the way we are. But I do think all of this still calls for the exploration of what effective teaching online looks like. And I do think at some point we're going to have to get over ourselves thinking that it's only an individual instructor who can control his or her own class without any recommendation from peers or best practices in pedagogy and instruction, and actually develop cultures of teaching and learning. It's been a challenge in a lot of places. You've got some great ones in Texas there. Austin does this very well. Some others do as well. But to really get at how do we help faculty support other faculty? And I would argue that a strong statement coming from faculty about what effective teaching online looks like for those colleges who don't have it would be really important to develop this summer. 3 more recommendations, and I'll wrap up as we move into the last couple of minutes. I want to save some places for questions. From CCRC, talking about integrating active learning into the classroom. Again, another problem we had pre-pandemic, that if we're going to talk about 21st century skills, that we need to actually have those 21st century approaches in our classrooms. If students need these skills to thrive in a post-COVID economy, and Diego Navarro out of California, who's started the Academy for College Excellence and has done a lot of thinking about active learning and the intersection between that and pedagogy, that we need to do some training for these types of things so that faculty can learn what does active learning look like in an online classroom? It may not be that intuitive to some folks who haven't taught online before, or even ones who have taught online before. So how do we kind of get that professional development about infusing active learning and a focus on 21st century skills into the classroom? The 8th of these, you guys have all wrestled with these. I mean, the technology-related inequities are not small. For many students, as AACC shares, the only device they have is their phones. What do we adapt? How do we adapt to that format? Is it, laptops is one strategy. Do we have enough laptops out there? I mean, Wi-Fi is another huge problem. Wi-Fi hotspots are great. We've heard a lot of stories about colleges upping the Wi-Fi in their parking lot. Stories out of California and Texas and Illinois on this front about students having the only opportunity to be able to come to campus to use Wi-Fi. Are we making assumptions about what our students have and are able to get? And so these technology-related inequities are huge, and each college is going to need their kind of own strategy to deal with them. But we know that wherever you are, they're very real. The more rural of you in Texas, you have connectivity issues that you may not have in the Metroplex in Dallas. Or in the Houston and San Antonio areas, where other inequities are in place in more urban areas around technology. So how do we go about this? And finally, I mentioned that the integration of student financial stability efforts, that ensuring that students are aware of and can access supports. We have a whole separate presentation we did on the CARES Act and making sure that the CARES Act is available to the students who need it the most and doesn't become yet another entitlement for kind of the middle class and the upper middle class around the CARES Act, when the folks who have more social capital, more resources, don't have the technology-related equities. You can see there's a rant to the side I'm shelving there. But how do we make sure that the CARES Act funds, and if, by the way, you can't give CARES Act funds because of the requirements from the Department of Ed, what other resources do you have at your disposal for your foundations or community resources to try to get at these basic needs that are even so much more important for students right now, so they can advance in their pathways? And do faculty and staff know about the connections between the resources that you do have available within the institution, or potentially also with partners? The idea of a student services syllabus that may become even more important this summer around what are the resources that are available to students. And we think of student services syllabi as a feature for students, but it's equally a feature for your faculty and for your staff to have a resource when they get asked difficult questions that they may not know the answer to. And so those are the kind of 9 kind of ideas. You can tell that there's a lot of course, of details to be worked out under those 9 ideas, but we reflected on those as kind of the big ideas that would be affected by the pandemic. And just real quickly at the end here, I'm not going to have too much time to go into this. This could be a topic of another webinar. We just released a series of Equity Through Pathways discussion guides in California, kind of focusing on shining an equity lens on various pieces of the Lost Momentum framework. And you'll note in here that there's a link where you can download these. They are 3 to 5 page guides. They're short explorations of a guided pathways topic with an equity lens. Texas is very represented in our authors list. Luis Panwan from Texas A&M, Linda Garcia from CESI, Robert Vela from SAC are each authors of one of the guides. Laura Rendon was involved in the initial convening. We've had some great support from some Texas folks on this project. And these were pre-pandemic again, but they are important if you think about the loss momentum framework and how students move through your institutions. They are very accessible, they're short, they have PowerPoints associated with them. You'll see a link in the PowerPoint, which will be sent out to you. You also can just download them at nci-improve.com. They're not meant to be the definitive word, they're just meant to kind of advance discussions on a college campus. Just to show you the titles of some of these really quickly, we're talking about application through the first day of classes, supporting connection and belonging, taking an asset-based approach to onboarding, reducing equity gaps in math and English attainment. You guys got John Hetz next week. What a great way to focus on multiple measures. Classroom instruction with a diverse community of learners. That's the one from Luis Panwan, which is great stuff. You've got Linda Garcia on integrating non-academic supports into the student journey. Tia McNair from AAC and U on created active and culturally responsive learning environments. The last couple on fostering faculty diversity, Ed Buss from Cosumnes River College in Sacramento wrote this very edgy guide on how to really, if you're going to be serious about faculty diversity, how do you get there? Then we have 2 guides that are fascinating from Bill Scroggins in California on promoting equity as a white CEO, and then also promoting equity as a CEO of color from Michael Baston of SUNY Rockland. And so, and there's also, by the way, a self-assessment for equity that our friends at the NAACP co-wrote along with NCII, a short self-assessment for equity. So just another set of resources there you can see on the website. And I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I'm happy to explore any questions, and we'll hand it back over to Christy and to Cynthia. And again, thank Alison for setting this up so perfectly. I love the way she talked about the process and the culture around how to think about this work right now. And hopefully in the second half of this, we gave you some ideas of places to look. If I were you, my final suggestion here would be to find what are 2 or 3 aspects of the student experience that maybe get elevated because of the pandemic that you need to work on as students get ready to come in the summer and fall. It can't be 100 things. Alison talked about the overall kind of overwhelmingness of this all. But what are 2 or 3 things that you might want to elevate? Maybe it's how do we make sure every student's got that plan, even in an online world. Maybe it's we really want to make sure we create a sense of connection and belonging in the fall, even in an online world. Maybe it's we want to get active learning into the classroom. Whatever those 2 or 3 things are, then really going through the process that Alison talked about, I think sounds like a really ripe area of opportunity for me as you all do this great work to serve students. And we know you've done heroic work already, and the work in front of you is daunting. But I would suggest to you that the time you take planning and thinking through this and how the student experience is going to look for your students, both returning and new in the fall, is really going to pay off for your new students. And with that, I will stop sharing and hand it back to my colleagues, Cynthia and Christy.
Thank you so very much, Rob and Alison. What a great time we've had together. So timely, so informational. Thank you so much, Rob. I'm going to go and look at those papers that you're writing on equity. That's so important. So thank you for that. So right now the Q&A is still open. If anyone wants to type in there, we have 5 minutes left of Q&A. For those of you who are typing right now or looking for questions that have been asked, be sure to click on the answered questions, because Rob and Alison have been answering questions all along. So you have time to look for that as you're typing in new questions. But I don't see any questions coming in just yet. So I'm going to open, as they're typing, I'm going to open it up to Alison and Rob, kind of as parting comments, like if you wanted to underscore anything that was said today. What would you say that you'd like as parting comments? We'll go to Alison and Rob. First, a question from Linda. Yes, of course. These slides are going to be available as well as this recording of the webinar. It's going to be placed out on the Texas Success Center website under the events page, so you can access it there. And
so
yes, so also the reference list, the reference list, the questions are coming in, the reference list that went through on this, they will be with the slides that will be on our events page. So with that, I'm going to turn to Alison.
So I was just going to say, actually, that I also am incredibly excited, Rob, about the equity pieces that you've put together for California. And it seems to me that, you know, as you said so well, and the work, just through the work that you're doing around the country, that helping people refocus those conversations and the case making and the broader why of Guided Pathways work anchored in an operationalized commitment to equity and equity consciousness seems like a great, that would be my short recommendation would be go track down those things that Rob put together and use them as a point of departure for your student success leadership team to think about how to be clearer about the broader stakes of your work with respect to equity and the recovery of your institutions and communities. So that's what I'm going to do.
And Alison, I mean, I think it's like, I mean, just to be clear, these authors, we got this incredible list of authors together, and we were incredibly fortunate. And they each just kind of shared like a lens onto the student experience, and to step back a bit and think of how it's received by the different types of students that you have. And some of these guides are pretty edgy. They call out the issues of white supremacy and historical racism in institutions. And one of the things that Bill Scroggins, the white CEO, says is you have to, if you are a white leader talking about this, you have to call out the role of white privilege and not be afraid to call it out and still work on it. And so the guides they're not all that edgy, but they do bring up some really interesting questions. And I think Ed Bush's on faculty diversity, I mean, it doesn't solve the problem, but one of the things that he did with his California funding, the Guided Pathways funding in California, is he actually hired someone whose job it is to go recruit faculty of color from non-traditional places to apply for jobs at Cosumnes River. Right? I mean, his assertion, and I may agree with him, is that the deck is stacked against faculty of color in applying for these positions. So if you're going to restack that deck, you need to do things differently and disrupt, as he says, the historical system that leads to very non-diverse pools. And so there are some great ways to look at it. One of the other guys, I think Tia McNair, one of the things that pops to mind says, we can't assume that the experience of white students is the baseline with which to measure our equity work, that we actually have to validate all student experiences that come to the work. And so there's just a lot of great stuff in there. I don't think it's, again, perfectly pandemic addressed, but it's refocusing us on the student experience and who's getting left behind that I think is really important. And I would strongly urge you that there's so much, the nuggets in Alison's, the deep thinking in Alison's presentation about how to step back and think about the work and meeting people where they are. And all of us, Alison and I and other national people, are trying to think about the work we do this fall in the context of all that you will be dealing with at the colleges. Like we can't just assume, oh, we were going to do all these events in person, we'll just take them online, when you're dealing with not only having to do things in an online setting, but having to constantly rethink that student experience in real time. We are all here for you, but we're going to be thinking about that a lot as well.
Appreciate that. There's one last question then, and perhaps Rob, you talked a little bit about faculty maybe creating standards for best online teaching. So this question is related to that. How can you address how transferring credits will work going forward? How does one know about quality control?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. One might ask how we knew about quality control before. Would be my first response to that question. I don't think there's anything, unless the quality control issue, as Alison, I think I didn't get to see too closely, responded when I was presenting about the issue of who's actually taking the tests and proctoring and those type of things. I mean, the question of quality control is one I think a lot of us wrestle with to begin with. And I think that, you know, the student learning outcome movement, if you will, and where it had its fits and starts, was always about kind of trying not just to document learning for accreditation purposes, was to really document learning for quality. Are we achieving the goals we set out for students who pass through our programs? And so the transferring side, I think, is a separate question. And the implications of the pandemic on transfer are vast, and at the moment mostly unknown, as are, you know, you guys are in a state, there are very few states with deeply tight transfer policy where this isn't going to be affected at all by the pandemic. But could one form a hypothesis that four-year schools are going to be less accepting of transfer credits because of the pandemic? Yeah, I think historically that would be a pretty fair hypothesis to form. Some states have already taken action against that and are trying to create grace periods for transfer changes. But this is going to be a huge deal. I think there's already work going on. I think AACC and you guys, Sova, Aspen, CCRC on the kind of tackling transfer work that's going on, that I think the effects of the pandemic are going to be really critical. But I think the answers to about quality control really go back to that. What is on, if we're worried about the intersection between pedagogy and outcomes, like what's our line in the sand on that? How do we document learning in this world that we are forced to deal with now because of the pandemic?
Thank you so very much, Rob, Allison. Can't thank you enough for coming to Texas and being part of our Texas work and making us all better for having known you. Thank you for spending time with us today. And with that, we'll close out. If we were together face to face, we'd all stand up and give you a standing ovation for coming and sharing with us and being a part of this. So thank you so very much. And with that, I say good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Bye-bye now.